Okay, so this video is eventually about Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, but first I need to do a relevant preamble on the sublime. See, movie buffs crave the sublime. In cinematic terms, the sublime, no relation, refers to the rare events where the action on screen leaves us, the audience, breathless with a sense of awe, that we are witnessing and thus feeling something extraordinary as a sequence of film exceeds our own imagination and even our perception of what is possible to be captured on camera. Because for young budding cinephiles, their first experience with the sublime may as well be their sexual awakening, because the sublime is essentially the intellectual cum shot. The type that makes you forget that you're watching a movie and instead make you feel like you're experiencing something transcendent. It's a damn near spiritual experience. Praise be to cinema god. It's just a high that movie lovers have chased since the dawn of this artistic medium. Hence why this feeling is referred to as the sublime. Historically speaking, the sublime was often captured through exceptional filmmaking techniques, an epic sense of scope, groundbreaking effects work, unparalleled production value, stunt work, and a multitude of other reasons. In fact, throughout cinema's history, there have always been innovators who engage in the sublime. We see this with a silent era comedian like Harold Lloyd as he climbs a building with minimal safeguards to prevent him from falling to his death, Buster Keaton's work in The General, and the actual film Train Crash, which stunned audiences as pointed out in the story of film by Mark Cousins, which, yes, I'm the most dangerous type of American. I read a book. There's the entire back half of the Titanic with all of its stunning special effects, the chaotic vehicular mayhem present in Mad Max Fury Road, and then of course, relevant to this video, there are the awesome stunts performed by Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible movies. Stunts for action sequences that modern filmmaking, even in movies that utilize stunt people rather than the do-it-yourself stunt work done by actors with a death wish like Tom Cruise, have fallen in disfavor due to the advent of computer-generated imagery, or CGI rather, and thus its eventual prioritization rather than utilizing more traditional means like stunt work and practical special effects. And look, I understand that some of this shift towards CGI is in part due to safety, which is more than fair because safety is important. So most movies, whether that be with stuntmen or actors pushing their mortal luck, probably shouldn't attempt a lot of the absolute batshit bonkers stuff that Tom Cruise performs in the Mission Impossible movies, mostly because stuntmen and actors have even been hurt on stunts and practical effects far less dangerous than the ones featured in the Mission Impossible movies. Meaning that I don't begrudge filmmakers for pivoting away from stunt work and practical effects if it's for safety reasons. However, creative laziness and using CGI as a crutch to the point that a movie doesn't feel real is another issue entirely though. Hence one of the reasons why I strongly dislike those Star Wars prequels from 2 decades ago. Yet, the Mission Impossible movies showcase the appeal and value of stunt work and practical effects, arguing the case that real people doing stunt work and practical effects when possible overall enhances a given action sequence rather than subtract from it. If anything, the Mission Impossible movies commit to the fact that these films are led by madman actor Tom Cruise, willing to do his own stunts like diving out of planes, ride a motorcycle off a cliff, and enthusiastically jump on Oprah's couch, which was probably the most controversial work of his career, well, aside from the whole Scientology thing. But look over there! It's a distraction! See, the stunts that Tom Cruise performs in the Mission Impossible films are stunning, the type of which that cause the audience to not only be nervous for the fate of Cruise's lead character Ethan Hunt, but to also be anxious regarding the safety and well-being of Tom Cruise himself as well, lest our Mission Impossible movie-going experience becomes a film documentation of Tom Cruise's mortal demise. If anything, these stunts are so incomparable in modern Hollywood filmmaking that we in the audience feel awestruck by the events on screen. In other words, Tom Cruise's death-defying stunt work is a great example of the sublime, because the stunts Cruise performs in these films are just above and beyond what we normally see in modern Hollywood cinema, all to the point that this is the primary appeal of the Mission Impossible series, because forget about the story, characters, and the weird way in which Tom Cruise runs. The stunts are the real reason why there have been 8 films in this franchise so far, because Tom Cruise defying death on camera is just the real reason why we venture to the multiplex to see these films. However, However, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning often forgets this. In fact, the most recent Mission Impossible venture, directed by longtime Tom Cruise collaborator Christopher McQuarrie, and a film that acts as a direct sequel to the prior film in the series, which was Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, places way too much of an emphasis on characters and story rather than the actual aforementioned appeal of these movies, which once again features Cruise doing things like jumping across tall buildings and holding onto a rope dangling from a helicopter that is in mid-flight. Yet Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning mistakenly shifts too much of its attention away from Tom Cruise's jaw-dropping antics and instead prioritizes its characters, their respective dilemmas, and the franchise's lore. Because yes, there be quick callbacks to characters and events that we as a cinema-going society have memory hold. They brought back this guy, and that's how you know this movie is important.
Shit just got real.
And admittedly, this doesn't necessarily need to be a problem. After all, some of the prior Mission Impossible movies did feature references to films preceding them, and the characters often displayed fun interpersonal dynamics that convinced the audience to give all the shits about the action on screen, even though these elements were never priorities. Though, quick aside, the previous film, Dead Reckoning, did have a little more narrative weight than usual, considering that the plot-important AI known as the Entity was a far more active presence in the film's narrative than compared to its passive presence in The Final Reckoning. But still, with that said, in terms of characters, plot, and lore, the Mission Impossible films ain't deep, meaning that these elements were not showstoppers. They were just adhesives gluing the rest of the movie's Tom Cruise-fueled mayhemic reigns of terror together with a narrative that was fine enough, allowing these respective films to emotionally connect with the audience, despite being of minimal actual substance. If anything, these elements rarely ever detracted from the appeal of the Mission Impossible movies and instead complemented them. Just like how you should all compliment your significant other, or significant others for my polycule friends, and tell them how awesome they are and how much you love them. Unfortunately, though, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning missed this memo. If anything, the front half of this film really drags, seeing as that the movie's two show-stopping stunts, the ones involving an underwater submarine and the biplane sequence, are in the back half of the movie. And that's a problem for two reasons. Firstly, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is nearly 2 hours and 50 minutes long. So when I say that the front half drags like a small dog's massive ball sack, you need to understand that that means roughly an hour and 20 minutes of much ado about jack shit. And secondly, every element of the first half of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is lackluster at best. The action and espionage elements are nearly non-existent, and when they do appear, they're very rudimentary and lack creative or stylistic flair, meaning that they're just stock standard hand-to-hand fighting sequences and such. Like the first hour plus of this film is just sorely missing the Mission Impossible franchise's sense of playfulness, and you can tell this by just comparing The Final Reckoning to all the other Mission Impossible films. In fact, there's no real usages or reveals with the iconic masks. Like in the intro to Dead Reckoning, there aren't any viscerally thrilling vehicle chases akin to the motorcycle sequence in Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation, and the hand-to-hand fights are just missing the thoughtful utilization of space and setting, like the bathroom brawl in Mission Impossible Fallout. If anything, there just isn't a whole lot of fun to be had in Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning's front 50%, which overall negatively affects the film's pacing, all to the point where the viewer feels numbingly bored during this lengthy stretch of the film. It's a big problem. And then there's the blunt and eye-roll inducing dialogue. Because the mission may be impossible, but the exposition is a fucking certainty. In fact, this exposition is repetitive and mentions the stakes of the narrative ad nauseum about the threat of worldwide nuclear annihilation, no relation, as well as how Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning repeatedly hypes up Ethan Hunt's resume and credentials, informing us of how awesome he is and all the cool shenanigans he has done in the previous movies, instead of, actually showing us the cool shenanigans he can do in this movie. And look, I know that show don't tell is a more malleable rule than what a few armchair movie critics on the internet say, especially on this hellhole of a website, may she live forever. But if you, a prospective filmmaker with class and taste, are opting to go heavy on the dialogue sans action, that said dialogue better be really damn good, which unfortunately is not the case for Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. In fact, the writing just bludgeons the audience with verbal blunt force trauma through its awful exposition and dialogue to the point that the film feels unevenly paced. Hell, some of the exposition explaining the parameters of Ethan's eventual stunts and the stakes of the narrative is over-explained like a goddamn video game tutorial. At certain moments, I was expecting some text to pop up saying, "Press X to perform a Tom Cruise." In other words, the writing just isn't up to the series standard, undermining Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning as a whole, as well as ignoring the appeal of the Mission Impossible series. Hey movie, we came to watch Tom Cruise do Tom Cruise shit, because any narrative, thematic, or character development that happens in these films is supposed to be in service of Tom Cruise doing Tom Cruise shit. If anything, it almost feels as if Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning's creatives got too preoccupied with franchise lore and the legacy of its lead to the point of forgetting that lore and characters aren't what make these movies special. Because creatively speaking, the movie had its head up its own ass, pretty much overstating its narrative and thematic impact. And this is frustrating because Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning's back half is actually pretty awesome. By its conclusion, the movie at long last fulfills the franchisal promise of featuring Tom Cruise performing stunts that no other actor should ever attempt. Chief among these stunts being the stunning biplane sequence where Cruise is hanging on for dear life as that said biplane twirls and even flies upside down, and then there's the sunk submarine section where Cruise is in a massive spinning set like those utilized in 2001: A Space Odyssey and Inception, but essentially add a hefty dosage of water, because Tom Cruise understands the importance of hydration. These are just very impressive sequences and thus capture the sublime, a type of thrill that the Mission Impossible series has always unabashedly embodied. Hell, even by Mission Impossible standards, the two primary stunts in Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning are rad as balls, meaning that the movie's back half just bangs, and thus it's worth watching the film for those reasons alone. But does that mean that Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is a good movie? Unfortunately, no. If anything, I'm pretty disappointed, because the exceptional back half of the movie just can't be reconciled with the first half's rudimentary, repetitive exposition, plotting pace, weak action, and an absence of stunts that transcend the audience into a state of cinematic bliss. Because to be clear, roughly 50% of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is a bad film, mostly because way too much of it is a snooze-a-palooza that takes its sweet-ass time to get to the good shit, the stuff that convinces us to be present at the multiplex and buy their ridiculous popcorn buckets to begin with. And even though Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning does achieve liftoff and thus soars away from subpar mediocrity, I just can't ignore how flagrantly uneven this whole cinematic endeavor is, because it's overall just an immensely frustrating experience that caused me to dwell on what it could have been if its front half had better execution. Because even though Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning does capture the sublime, it unfortunately takes too long to get there.